Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kris. I'm about to snack on a mango, you can't see it, ginger chew. They're pretty good. They're weird looking. They're brown with a little bit of, like, coated a little bit of sugar. This is part 7 of Kings and Generals. Ow. Battle of Yorktown, 1781, American Revolution. I just gave it the thumbs up. You can do that for me. That helps tremendously. You can subscribe to the channel. And if you want to see, you can't see this one, but if you wanted to see your name sponsored, Battle of Yorktown, 1781, all you gotta do is click the thanks button, donate to the channel, request a video, and there you go. You can still request a video and not donate. Just takes a little longer to get to. So let's get to the Battle of Yorktown, 1781.
Kings Mountain was the first setback for Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis's southern campaign. With his flank now exposed and his forces severely diminished.
Sorry. Get a little better quality here.
He was forced to withdraw from North Carolina into South Carolina. Heavy rain at the Catawba River forced him to make camp near Land's Ford and wait for the weather and his own health to improve. Far from his Charleston supply base and in a backcountry already stripped of forage, Cornwallis realized that the situation was becoming desperate. He would either have to win this campaign outright and soon, or abandon most of the previous year's conquests. The famous and decisive Battle of Yorktown was on the horizon. This video is made available for free thanks to our YouTube members and patrons. We fund our Thanks for supporting us. Britain was losing the war. In India, France and its ally, the Kingdom of Mysore, were threatening the British East India Company's hegemony. In the Caribbean theatre, France gradually gained the upper hand and Sugar Islands fell. An attempt to retake the momentum by capturing Martinique was ruined by the Great Hurricane of 1780. The deadliest hurricane ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere sank 15 British warships and demasted 7 more throughout the Atlantic. In contrast, only 1 French frigate sunk. Worse, it left no tree or building standing on Barbados, including the naval facilities and ports. Survivors reported the fort's heavy cannons flying 100 feet into the air. It seemed nature itself had turned on Britain. Baton Rouge, Natchez and Mobile in West Florida had all fallen to Spanish Louisiana's governor Bernardo de Galvez. Pensacola was saved when another hurricane scattered the Spanish fleet, but would not withstand another siege. Meanwhile, Gibraltar had survived its first trial, but the Great Siege was still unbroken. Lord North's government had been unpopular before France joined the war, and with the war going increasingly poorly, it was teetering toward collapse. The Whig opposition's calls for peace at any price were gaining strength as Britain's finances and strategic position crumbled. As Cornwallis's victories had been the only bright spot in 1780, North and George Germain were increasingly pressuring him to give them more and save their administration. Things weren't fully going France's way either. While the war was proceeding successfully, it was proceeding too slowly. French finances were nearing collapse. Already billions of livres in debt, Louis XVI's personal credit was cratering as he took out more loans to fund the war. Most of France's currency was being spent on its military, and what was left was paying for the Continental Army. France couldn't afford to continue fighting much longer. Consequently, Versailles secretly decided to take a more active role in North America to force an end to that conflict. Orders were issued to more actively support the Continental Army with both land and naval units as the opportunity arose, but French officers weren't to make any commitments. Intervention needed to be on French terms and at French convenience. Meanwhile, 1780 had proved a mixed bag for George Washington and the Continental Army. Over the summer, they'd finished hemming Clinton into New York, even repelling several attempts to stop them. However, the betrayal and defection of Benedict Arnold in September was a huge disgrace. The Southern campaign was a disaster, but Horatio Gates's humiliation at Camden was a blessing. It enabled Washington to sideline the arrogant and obstinate general, while also silencing those in Congress who still dreamed that open, decisive battles would win the war. Washington replaced Gates with Nathanael Greene, whom Washington wanted in command all along. To assist him, Washington dispatched Colonel Light Horse Harry Lee's cavalry and asked Daniel Morgan to postpone his retirement for one last fight in the backwoods.
For anyone who doesn't know, Light Horse Harry Lee was the father of later Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Light Horse Harry Lee was attacked for defending. He wasn't much of a father in terms of being in Robert E. Lee's life. He was defending a printing press, I believe, around the War of 1812, and was telling the people to go home. He was attacked, beaten, and then I believe I've also heard different things, but he had either hot wax or hot metal, boiling metal, poured in his eyes. I'm going to check so people don't think I'm just talking shite. Light Horse Harry Lee injuries.
According to American Battlefield Trust, Henry Lee III, as he was referred to after the American Revolution, Light Horse.
Okay, you're not telling me anything. Sorry. There you go. He's the father of Robert E. Lee. He died March 25th, 1818, 62. Later life and death. Okay. He asked President James Madison for a commission at the onset of the War of 1812, but without success. 1812, he published his memoirs. During civil unrest in Baltimore, Maryland, 1812, Lee received grave injuries while helping to resist an attack on his friend Alexander Conti Hanson. Lee suffered, these people were beaten. Lee suffered extensive internal injuries and head and face wounds, and even his speech was affected. His observed symptoms were consistent with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. He never recovered from those injuries. Hold on. I just want to double check on the I want to check to make sure that what I just said was true. Come on. If you don't want to go through this, I'll wave just before I hit the start button to restart this. But I just want to make sure that I'm not wrong. I could have... Yeah. I don't really want to go scrolling. Yeah, this is... Harry Nelson injured. Hanson shot himself. Lee had stressed every measure. Where's Page? They're attacking the building. Blah, 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 blah. I just felt like waving, and then people would be like, "Oh, good, he's back to doing this and then just say psych and go right back to this. Yeah, it's a really long article here, and I'm just scrolling. Okay, but anyways, he got beat up pretty good at the War of 1812. Okay, welcome back.
Greene had proven to be Washington's most dependable officer and a gifted strategist, and the rough terrain of the Carolinas was Lee and Morgan's natural habitat. Washington gave Greene two primary orders: first, to preserve his army; second, to defeat Cornwallis. Greene took command of the Southern Department in October 1780. He had roughly 1,500 soldiers ready to fight, of which only 950 were Continental regulars. The arrival of Lee's legion brought that up to 2,000, but Cornwallis's army of roughly 3,500 still dwarfed them. There were limited reinforcements and replacements available besides militia, who weren't keen to fight in the fall rains or remain in camp waiting. Thus, Greene decided to refit and resupply his army on the march, moving south to reoccupy Charlotte following Cornwallis's withdrawal. Morgan joined him on December 3rd, and Greene began to plan his campaign against Cornwallis, who was growing desperate. Cornwallis's army was falling apart in the Carolina backcountry from desertion, hunger, and disease. His badly overstretched supply lines were under constant militia harassment, and no reinforcements were available. Cornwallis's only orders from Commander-in-Chief Henry Clinton were to conquer Georgia and the Carolinas without any vision of how. Clinton was distracted, clashing with Vice Admiral Marriott Arbuthnot over war strategy. The men couldn't and wouldn't work together, but neither could one prosecute the war without the other. Thus, Clinton de facto abdicated all responsibility for the upcoming year's strategy to Cornwallis, who planned to reinvade North Carolina as soon as practical. Greene and his war council agreed that fighting Cornwallis in open battle was stupid. Instead, they would trick him into dividing his army into defeatable chunks and draw the rest into the wilderness to starve. To achieve this, Greene first sent Lee to link up with Francis Marion's guerrillas and raid Cornwallis's supply lines, hoping to draw off Banastre Tarleton's British Legion. Meanwhile, Morgan would take 400 regulars and 200 experienced militia to the western end of the Catawba to reassure the populace, recruit more militia, and forage for supplies. Cornwallis learned of Morgan's movement shortly after Christmas, which threatened his flank. Further, his intelligence wrongly told him that Morgan was moving against the exposed garrison at 96. Tarleton's light troops were quickly dispatched as reinforcements. Upon reaching 96 and realizing that Morgan wasn't actually coming, Tarleton called for and received heavier troops to confront Morgan in the backcountry. This proved disastrous. Quickly learning that Tarleton was after him, Morgan hatched a plan. He withdrew north towards the Broad River, arriving just past Hannah's cowpens on January 16th. Tarleton had been pushing the march to catch up across swollen rivers and muddy roads, and would therefore arrive exhausted. Knowing that Tarleton would immediately attack anyway, Morgan prepared his roughly 1,800 troops to take advantage of Tarleton's arrogance. First, Morgan placed the army between the Broad and Pacolet rivers, making sure his soldiers knew there was no escape. It would be victory or death. Second, he placed his regulars on a low hill between a ravine and a creek. Next, to encourage Tarleton to launch a reckless attack, he placed the militia in front of his regulars, with orders to fire 2 volleys before retreating into the woods on the left. In front of the militia he placed sharpshooters, whose primary job was to bait Tarleton to attack if he showed any signs of pausing to think. Tarleton roused his 1,150 men at 0200 on January 17th for their 5th day of forced marching and the 3rd without food. Learning the location and composition of Morgan's troops, Tarleton pushed his men harder, smelling another victory. Reaching cowpens just before dawn, Tarleton prepared to attack immediately, with his infantry in the center, dragoons on the wings, and his legionnaires in reserve. Immediately after emerging from the woods, Tarleton ordered his dragoons forward, only for the sharpshooters to force them back. Not waiting for the dragoons to reform, nor for all his infantry to emerge, Tarleton ordered an infantry charge. The sharpshooters withdrew to the second line and joined them in firing 2 volleys before retreating. As expected, Tarleton took the bait and recklessly advanced into the teeth of the Continental regulars. As the centre began to falter, the 71st Highlanders attempted to flank the American right. The Virginia militia in the area misunderstood orders to intercept them and began an orderly withdrawal. The Highlanders broke ranks to chase them down, only for the Virginians to realize their mistake, about face, and fire directly into the Scots' faces, breaking them. At the same time, the Continentals launched a bayonet charge, which broke the British line. Many exhausted regulars simply threw themselves on the ground among the wounded. Tarleton ordered his legionaries to attack, only for them to flee. Desperate, he organized a final charge with 50 dragoons, only to be surprised by the American cavalry. In the melee, Tarleton and the American commander wounded each other in a duel, though Tarleton escaped. Less than 200 British soldiers escaped the battle, at the cost of only 150 American casualties. When Tarleton rejoined Cornwallis, the latter snapped his sword in anger. In fairness to Tarleton, he'd easily won every other battle he'd ever commanded with a frontal cavalry charge. However, his arrogance had cost Cornwallis a quarter of his army, including most of his best troops. Morgan moved out from Cowpens within a few hours of the battle to regroup with Greene, correctly believing that Cornwallis would react strongly to Tarleton's disaster. His position in central Carolina was untenable, but to retreat following defeat was disgraceful. Cornwallis's back was to the wall. The only honourable solution was to move out and crush Greene immediately in an open battle. In his own words, "The loss of my light troops could only be remedied by the activity of the whole corps." Cornwallis ordered all but the most crucial baggage burned, including his own tent, to make the force march north faster. After forcing his way past Continental skirmishers guarding the Catawba fords on the 31st, he was delayed crossing the Yadkin due to a lack of boats.
Probably burned them.
Meanwhile, Greene moved to reunite his command. On February 3rd, he met Morgan near Trading Ford, with Lee rejoining on the 7th near Guilford Courthouse. With Cornwallis bearing down, Greene withdrew along the backcountry roads, marching towards the Dan River and safety. By February 10th, Cornwallis was 35 miles from Greene, moving fast enough to catch Greene before he reached the Dan. Greene dispatched his light troops, sending them on a longer route to hopefully distract and redirect Cornwallis from the slower-moving main force. It worked. While Cornwallis chased the light troops, Greene escaped across the Dan midday on February 14th, after Tadeusz Kościuszko requisitioned every watercraft on the river. The light troops then raced 40 miles in 16 hours to beat Cornwallis over the river by less than 3 hours. Cornwallis's desperate march had been for nothing. With the race to the Dan lost, Cornwallis withdrew to Hillsborough to forage for supplies. It was a fool's errand, as the area was already thoroughly depleted. 240 miles from his supply base at Camden, Cornwallis resorted to indiscriminately plundering farms to feed his army. Meanwhile, Greene's army found Halifax County, Virginia, rich in food, clothing and recruits. After a week's rest and refit, Greene dispatched Lee back across the Dan to discourage any remaining loyalists and capture or kill Tarleton if the opportunity arose. Cornwallis had placed his last hope for resupply on untapped loyalists flocking to the royal banner. About 400 loyalists under Dr. John Pyle from Chatham County answered. Lee found them on February 24th while looking for Tarleton. The loyalists mistook Lee for Tarleton, who was supposed to escort them to Cornwallis, as the men wore similar uniforms. Once inside the militia's camp, Lee attacked, killing 93 and scattering the rest, breaking loyalist morale and putting an end to them as a military force. Meanwhile, Greene recrossed the Dan on February 22nd. With his army reduced to 2,000 men by disease and desertion, Cornwallis moved south across Alamance Creek, still hoping to receive loyalist reinforcements before engaging. Greene made camp 15 miles away to pin down Cornwallis. By March 6th, it was clear to Cornwallis that he had to force a battle and marched out of camp. Greene, reinforced by North Carolina militia to 4,400 men, retreated to Guilford Courthouse and made ready to fight. The two armies first clashed before dawn as the scouts collided near New Garden Meeting House. Greene used the now retired Morgan's tactic of deploying his army in 3 lines. The first behind a split-rail fence composed of North Carolina militia and Virginia riflemen, the second the Virginia militia, the third his Continentals and artillery. Cornwallis arrived on the field around 1330 and attacked in 2 assault columns. The battle developed as at Cowpens, with the first 2 American lines firing into the British before retiring behind the third. However, unlike at Cowpens, the British were rested and began pushing through the third line. Then a Continental countercharge threatened to overwhelm the British line. Realizing the danger, Cornwallis ordered his cannons to fire grapeshot into the melee, killing both Continentals and his own soldiers, but successfully stopping the melee. To avoid another Camden, Greene withdrew. Cornwallis won the battle, but it was utterly Pyrrhic. He'd suffered 526 casualties, rendering his army combat ineffective, and gained nothing but more uninhabited wilderness. His efforts to spin the battle as a great victory were laughed out of Parliament. Adding insult to injury, his men had no tents and suffered through torrential rains for the next several days. Greene had about 300 casualties, but his strategy had always been, as he said, "We fight, get beat, rise and fight again." Cornwallis retreated to Hillsborough again raised the royal standard to call for loyalists, and again none came. Lacking any other choice, he was forced to march for Wilmington, hoping the Royal Navy could resupply and reinforce him. Greene marched on Camden to lure Cornwallis back, but he didn't take the bait. So Greene went on the offensive. By October, he'd retaken the southern interior, with the British only holding Charleston and Savannah. Cornwallis reached Wilmington on April 7th to find limited supplies and paltry reinforcements. London had begun to communicate directly with Cornwallis, violating chain of command protocols and leaving Clinton uninformed. Thus, Clinton didn't know how desperate Cornwallis actually was, and hadn't prepared the needed relief. This left Cornwallis conflicted. His only orders from Clinton were to remain in the Carolinas, but that was impossible without substantial reinforcements. The nearest source was in Virginia, where British Brigadier Benedict Arnold and Major General William Phillips were campaigning. Pressured by Germain to move north and secure Virginia, Cornwallis abandoned the Carolinas and began marching north. Back north, the British had been wreaking economic devastation on Virginia, while Marquis de Lafayette and Baron von Steuben harassed them, under orders to first preserve their armies and second, summarily hang Arnold. Phillips and Arnold were camped near Petersburg, when Cornwallis sent word that he was moving to link up with them. As he did so, he indiscriminately looted and burned every farm he came across, seeking food and horses for his soldiers and the nearly 12,000 slaves following him. Cornwallis arrived on May 19th, finding Phillips dead of fever and the soldiers grumbling about being led by a traitor. Taking command, Cornwallis sent Arnold back to New York to finally inform Clinton about the situation. While waiting for the response, he decided to execute Phillips's orders from Clinton to fortify either Yorktown or Portsmouth, choosing the latter. On the way, he engaged with Lafayette, winning some minor engagements. Meanwhile, on May 6th, Washington received good news. The French army under Comte de Rochambeau, which had been defending the French fleet holding in Newport for the past year, was being released to him, and the Caribbean fleet, now under Comte de Grasse, might be able to come north to help him in late summer. He'd finally have the numbers for decisive action. Meanwhile, Clinton was furious at Cornwallis, knowing the southern colonies were now lost again. However, it was too late to turn him back, and Clinton had bigger problems. The French arrived in Washington's camp on July 7th, and it looked like they were planning to storm New York. Already confused or uninformed about Cornwallis's position, Clinton sent 2 letters, one ordering Cornwallis to move to Yorktown, the other to Williamsburg, ordering to send all unneeded troops to defend New York. As he was already en route to Portsmouth, Cornwallis chose to move there instead. On July 20th, as troops were loading into transports, new orders arrived. Cornwallis was to instead move with all troops to either Williamsburg or Yorktown to build a deep-water port at the Navy's request. Irritated, Cornwallis still loaded his whole army and sailed for Yorktown, arriving August 6th, with Lafayette following by land. Back in New York, Washington actually was hoping to use French aid to storm New York. However, all his officers and Rochambeau were against it. They favored moving against Cornwallis, a softer target. Washington held out until August 14th, when updates on de Grasse's plans arrived. De Grasse had the discretion to sail as far north as Chesapeake Bay, but only if it didn't risk his Caribbean gains. Determined to sail north, de Grasse received assurances that the Spanish would protect French colonies now in exchange for help with Spanish operations that November. This enabled him to set sail on August 15th. Realizing New York was off the table, Washington finally agreed to move south. Taking his best troops with him, Washington and Rochambeau began marching to Virginia on August 19th. Lafayette was ordered to keep Cornwallis in Yorktown. To keep Clinton in New York, Washington used a multi-layered deception, in addition to leaving behind substantial garrisons. First, the Culper Ring fed Clinton real information about Washington's desire to attack, then disinformation about his plans to attack. Secondly, Washington had troops visibly march along the New Jersey shore, carrying boats, and making camp as if they intended to attack Staten Island. Third, he kept the target of his actual march a secret. The deception worked. Clinton didn't believe his scouts' reports that Washington was gone until September 2nd. De Grasse arrived off Yorktown on August 30th. Meanwhile, the Newport fleet had sailed for Yorktown on August 25th, carrying the French siege equipment. The British were aware of both.
I went to Williamsburg in February 2021. I wanted to go to Yorktown, but it was closed because of COVID. And I wanted to go to Jamestown as well, but that was also closed. But Williamsburg was open. But not everything at Williamsburg was open, so I wasn't able to visit the, what do they call it, the Triangle? I don't remember, but I want to go back there.
Movements, and Rear Admiral Thomas Graves, Arbuthnot's replacement, sailed with 5 New York-based capital ships and 14 from the Caribbean fleet to intercept de Grasse. On September 5th, Graves was surprised to find de Grasse's fleet in the Chesapeake, who was in turn surprised to see Graves at all. While de Grasse scrambled to get his 24 capital ships into fighting order, Graves moved to block the bay's mouth. Concerned about shoals and already leaky ships, Graves didn't try to intercept the French as they formed up. Instead, he waited until 1400, when the French were moving east from the bay entrance, to order his ships to wear and engage. The fleet's vanguards engaged at 1600, with the centres engaging around 1700. The battling fleets drifted eastwards until nightfall. The older British ships took more damage than the French, but the battle was otherwise a tactical draw. The fleets continued drifting without engaging until September 9th, when the Newport fleet successfully entered the Chesapeake. Having accomplished his mission, de Grasse returned to Yorktown, while Graves sailed to New York for repairs. Washington arrived outside Yorktown on September 17th after stopping to visit his home, Mount Vernon, for the first time since the war began. By September 26th, the army of roughly 9,000 American regulars and militia and 11,000 French soldiers was assembled, and the order was given to lay siege. The Allied forces bombarded Cornwallis's 9,000 troops, gradually moving closer to the city over the coming weeks. Despite constant pleas for help from Cornwallis, no help ever came from Clinton. Clinton had promised to send 5,000 reinforcements and later a relief force, but Clinton's War Council concluded that until control of the sea was re-established, relief was impossible. It would take too long and be too costly to march to Virginia, assuming they could even break out. Thus, any relief had to wait for the fleet to be repaired. Graves wasn't ready to sail until October 19th, which was too late to save Cornwallis. Following the Allies successfully storming his redoubts, Cornwallis attempted to cross the York at Gloucester Point, only for a storm to wreck his boats. With the bombardment intensifying and no relief in sight, Cornwallis surrendered on October 17th. Cornwallis asked to receive the honours of war, only to be told he'd get the same honours shown to Benjamin Lincoln's army at Charleston. Humiliated, Cornwallis refused to surrender in person, claiming illness. Instead, he sent his subordinate, Brigadier Charles O'Hara, to offer his sword to Rochambeau.
I just saw something about Charles O'Hara. He was involved in the Napoleonic Wars, and he surrendered to Washington, and he surrendered to Napoleon later on. How crazy is that?
Who refused to accept and directed him to Washington, who in turn directed O'Hara to hand it to the recently exchanged Lincoln. An apocryphal tale claims that the British bands played "The World Turned Upside Down" as the soldiers laid down their weapons. Contrary to popular belief, the victory at Yorktown didn't end the American Revolution. However, it did start the chain of events that led to the end of the war 2 years later. In our next episode in this series, we will begin wrapping up.
That was pretty much the last battle, big battle. Because after the British Parliament found out, they were like, what are we doing? They pretty much believed that the colonies were lost and let's focus on everything else. So, okay, we're going to end it here. Battle of Yorktown. I really want to go back there. Well, I want to go there. I'd like to go back to Williamsburg. Like 1 out of every 3 stores was open. The other 2 were closed. They had really strange hours. I mean, it was right after COVID, and the vaccine wasn't out and stuff like that, so you can't be mad at people for being cautious. I get it. But I really wanted to go there and see more. All right, so we're going to end this here, and I will do this is part 7. I will do part 8 for sure. Probably going to do that next. But until then, have a good day, have a good night.